So it's just about winter time here up in the Northeast, and I'm actually building a workshop in my garage. This is what the workshop looks like right now. And it's getting to a point where it's too cold to do drywall mudding and painting. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna install a garage heater, and I'm gonna show you how to do that today. All right, so this is the garage heater I picked up. I'll drop a link down in the description if you're interested. I got this on Amazon and they had a $50 off coupon. So this requires a 30 amp 240 volt circuit to power this. All right, now one of the first steps before you go to mount the heater is you wanna figure out where the heater is gonna operate the best in the garage. And if you're using one unit, you kind of want to have that heater blowing towards your work area. You have to keep the heater away from any combustible surface a certain distance, and it does spec that out in the manual. I'm thinking about mounting the heater actually right up here and having it blow over here because I'm gonna have an L-shaped workbench in the corner here. We're gonna get some lag screws and washers. We're gonna pilot drill some holes, and we'll get that bracket mounted and the heater hung, and then we'll do the electrical. The heater itself's not very heavy, so it shouldn't be too bad. You can actually angle mount this. This has nutserts in the side of the body, and you can actually tilt this whole thing down. But I also have these adjustable louvers on here, so I'm just gonna use the louvers to point the heat where I want it to. I'm gonna land a box up top here, a 4x4 square box, and then I can run my Seal-Tight or Greenfield down to the heater. And then by having that box there, I can also run a pipe from that box straight over and then down the wall on this side over here, and I can have a 30 amp outlet there for my welder. All right, now there's one more thing I wanna mention too. If I ever decide to put a split unit in on the opposite side wall in here so I have cooling and heating, all I have to do is simply remove this heater and just run a line over to that new wall mount split unit, and I'm good to go. All right, so I'm just gonna drill a 3/4 inch hole through the sill plate that goes into my basement right about here. Okay, and that's where our power wire is gonna come in from the breaker panel. All right, now we're gonna feed this wire out through all of the holes that we just drilled out to the garage. Okay, and then I'm just gonna bend these over a little bit to keep this from pulling back through. All right, now I have this cable secured down in the basement. It's not going anywhere. We need to bond our metal box here. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna take this little extra piece here. We're gonna make a loop in there, and we're gonna put it around a bonding screw in the box. And what this does is since this is a metal box, this bonds the ground from the cable assembly passing through the box to the box. All right, so now that the box is mounted, we're gonna pop our knockout out here. All right, now to run our conduit down to this box, we're gonna use a straight conduit connector and a bushing to protect the wire. All right, now to mount the conduit clamps in, we're just simply gonna use some number 10 screws and some of these blue shields. All right, and that's all there is to mounting the conduit to the wall. I do have to bend some offsets in here so it sits nice and flat on the bottom. And then I'll also have to bend an offset at the box when we mount it over there. All right, now that we have our conduit run up to the ceiling, I'm gonna take a stick and I'm gonna run it over this way, and we'll get a box mounted on that side. And I'm using my jet ski as a ladder. Now, since I can see where my studs are, I'm not gonna use those blue shields going across. I'm just gonna use that one whole strap and some screws. So what we're using for the whip from the 4-inch square down to the heater itself is this 3/4 inch Liquid-Tight. That's where I'm gonna be coming in right there. We're gonna put our lock nut on the inside here. Pop out the knockout here. All right, so we got our whip made up. All we need to do now is run our wire from here through our box down to our other connection point, and then we can go down to the basement and wrap everything up. So the easiest way to do this is to pull your fitting off, because it's, especially if you're using a 90, it's really hard to get wire through a 90. All right, so let's get our wires inside of our heater connected. I always like to connect the ground first, and there is a ground screw in here. It may differ depending on the type of heater that you purchased. And then we'll get our ground in. You wanna make sure these connections are all really tight. Now let's loosen up our L1 and L2. These are both hot connections, so there is no neutral on this. Tighten that up, and then we'll do the same with L2. And that's all there is to connecting the 240 inside of the heater. All right, now let's get these connections made up. All right, this white we're not going to use for the heater, but we're going to cap it off. So we have our wire over to our panel. I want to give it a little bit of slack up top, and then I'm going to bring it down just a little bit past the panel here and cut it. And this will give us enough slack inside where if we need to make any loops on the wire or anything like that. So I'm actually going to be picking these two spots right here. It is a double pole breaker, so we'll have to pop both of these knockouts off. All right, guys, so at this point, I gotta give you a little disclaimer. If you're not comfortable working with electricity, please don't consult a professional. All right, so I'm gonna show you step by step what I do to tighten this circuit. So our first step is to remove the 4 panel screws and remove the front panel. And then I just rest an arm on the panel cover here. And then when I pull this cover off, I want to make sure I pull it straight off. This is a 100 amp service. We're going to be mounting our breaker right here. All right, and as you can see, here's our 3/4 inch knockout. We're going to be putting our Romex fitting in there. All right, so one other important thing is your circuit breaker. You can't just throw any old circuit breaker in here. You have to match your manufacturer of your panel. So this is a Murray panel, which is made by Siemens. This is the compatible breaker for that. As you can see, 30 amps, 2-pole, and we always install these with them off. And all they do is you hook in the backside and they fit over the blades on the bus bar. Just like that. All right, so now we want to get our wire fed into our connector. So we want to make sure that string relief on the connector is open. And then I'm going to try to guesstimate about where I want to strip the wire. And I'm just going to lightly press this on here. Very lightly. I'm not actually cutting into the cable. I'm just scoring this outer jacket, and it'll actually tear along that score line. You'll see it'll just split all the way up, and it'll peel right off. Super simple. And then we're gonna be very careful we don't touch any live parts in here while we feed this wire down into the panel. And I'm just pulling it off to the side as I feed it. And then once I see a little bit of the jacket inside, I stop. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tighten up that string relief on the top. Now the next step, depending on the panel type that you have, is going to differ. Now if you notice, my main breaker is in my panel, so this is called a main breaker panel. So there is also a main lug panel, and that is if your main disconnect is actually out at your meter, or if this is a sub panel. So you would just have a couple lugs on the top instead of having that main circuit breaker in this panel. Because of that, our neutrals and our grounds are actually bonded together, and you'll see this little copper jumper here with a green screw that actually bonds the ground and neutral bar to the panel. So if you have a main lug panel, your neutrals and your grounds will actually be isolated. All right, so my next step after we get the wire into the panel is to determine where my neutral and my ground are gonna go. I'm only using the ground for the heater, but because I want to run a welder eventually, I have to tie my neutral to this bar also. So I picked these two spots, so I'm just going to loosen up my 2 screws here so it will accept the wire. All right, so you want to be extremely careful with your ground wire because it is bare. So I'm going to peel the paper sheath off at this point here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to try to get this ground wire behind all of these other wires without touching them. And I always like to bend up the ground wire at the top of the panel, and that gives me a little extra if I ever need to move the breaker down a position or 2. And then I like to use needle nose during this step because it's really easy to guide the wires in. All right, and you wanna make sure after you put your ground in, your ground bus, you wanna make sure that you can see that wire sticking out the other side. We're nice and tight in there. So next we're gonna do our neutral. And I'm gonna actually leave like a little service loop in this at the bottom. And then we have a little bit extra when we do decide to upgrade this to a 200 amp panel to bring that wire down or move that breaker down if we need to. Our very last step is to connect our red and our black. All right, and then we're gonna put these behind all of this. All right, so we're gonna make sure that our circuit breaker is off, and then we're gonna land our black and our red now. And then we're gonna do our black wire first. All right, and just like that, we have our wires tied in. All right, so our next step after we turn our breaker on is to verify that we have 240 volts between the two. We have 238. I have 118 on the second leg, and I have 120 on the first leg. All right, so we determined that our breaker was going to go in the bottom spot here. All you do is you just take some pliers. I use linesman's. Grab it from the top, wiggle it back and forth a couple times. It comes right out. All right, so we're gonna get our panel cover back on. Now I always like to put the top screws in first, and I like to have the door open when I do this because I can see where all the breakers are and I can line it up perfectly. And then I can close the door. And we can go over to the other side, but before we tighten the other one up, we wanna make sure that we can see both holes on the bottom. All right, now that we're wrapped up downstairs, let's head out to the garage with our meter and check and make sure that we still have 238 volts at the heater, and then we'll turn it on and we'll test it out and see how it works. We have 240, that's what we're looking for. And then we'll check each one to ground, 122, 118.4. Perfect. All right, so I wanted to also give you guys an idea of the amperage this draws. So I'm on 3000 watt setting right now. So at 240 volts, that should be about 12.5 amps or so. We got 12.6. Let's put it on the 4000 watt. We got about 16.7. And we'll go to the full power 5000 watt. And we're drawing about 20.7. So that's just to give you an idea how much power this thing draws on each setting. So now we can just close our cover. We'll put our screw in. All right, so I shut off my light so you can see. So we have a power indicator. This is a fault light, and I think that's for over temperature. But all you need to do to turn this on is either pick, you just pick one of your settings, 3000, 4000, or 5000 watt. And you just turn your knob on your thermostat, and it's actually quite quiet. I'm really surprised. We're gonna let this sit for 10 minutes and see how warm this garage gets within 10 minutes. All right, so you can see we're at about 59.2 degrees. We were at 53.6, I believe, when we started. So it's come up about 6 degrees in 10 minutes. That's pretty decent. All right, guys, so that wraps it up for today's video. Super straightforward and really easy installation, in my opinion. If you're comfortable working with electricity and your breaker panel, you can do this yourself and save a ton of money. Thanks for watching, guys. Make sure to subscribe if you're not, and until next time.